I finished painting this portrait a few weeks ago, and in this video I'm going to show you how I paint skin textures to look like this using an airbrush to apply the paint and an eraser to remove it. In the last video we painted in a few of the major features like the eye, the eyebrow, and the nose, so the first thing that we need to do in this one is paint in the mouth, and once that's done we'll move on to painting the skin textures and that facial hair. If you didn't watch the first part, I'm painting this one on clayboard using a single color of black acrylic ink. There's no white within this mixture because all of the highlights are going to come from the substrate. The first thing that I'm doing here is adding some darker textures within the mustache, and I'm using that same paint, Schmincke Aero Colors Black. It's reduced about 20% here with distilled water. I'm spraying right around 25 psi, my airbrush is very close to the panel, and I'm just pulling very lightly back on the airbrush trigger to spray a thin line of paint, and while I'm doing that, I'm just moving it around in random motions. It's kind of like small circular motions that overlap and small squiggles. I'm paying attention to my reference, and I'm just applying this texture in random areas along the mustache. Now I already have a base layer of black paint down. That's what I sprayed in at the end of last week's video. So as I apply this texture over the top, there's not going to be too much contrast between the darks and lights. And before I go any further, I want to clean up some overspray within the background. So I'll use a soft eraser, just make a few passes back there to remove any of that paint from the panel. The transition between the hair and the skin textures is very important, so you're going to see here that as I'm painting in this lower part of the mustache, I'm making sure to add some random lines and textures along the edge. This way it's not too smooth. What I'm essentially doing here is extending a few of these lines past the point where the major dark values of the facial hair ends. This way that edge or transition between the mustache and that highlight above the upper lip just looks a little bit more natural. It doesn't look stenciled in, or it doesn't look like it was pasted on. And I'm doing the exact same thing along the top part of the mustache by painting a few lines up and then slightly over to the right. Again, I'm extending these past the major values within the facial hair and then up into that skin texture above it, which I'm going to show you how to paint later on in this video. And even with that little bit of work that I did here, it's like 2 minutes worth of painting, it's already starting to look like convincing facial hair. Now there's a lot more to do here, and I'm going to show you how we could push it much further. One thing that you may have noticed here are my graphite grid lines going right through this part of the painting. Now don't worry about those. Those are going to get removed later on as we paint in the skin texture. I'm going to be erasing over these areas, so all of those lines are going to be removed. For the lower part of this upper lip, I'm going to use a curved freehand shield, line it up with my drawing along the bottom, and then spray some paint up. And then for the top part of this lip, same thing. Line up that shield, spray some paint down. And this is going to give us the boundaries of the upper lip. Darker along the bottom and to the right, and then that thin darker shadow along the top. I already have that edge painted in, and I want to darken up this shadow along the top. So I'm just going to spray this in freehand. This is also going to help soften up some of the edges because no shield is used. And now while I'm doing this, I'm always spraying air, and I'm just slightly rocking back the trigger where I want to apply paint. And I always try to keep the airbrush moving, even if it's just a little bit. This way paint does not build up in one area. For the left side of this upper lip, I'm going to use a freehand shield that has a semicircle. Just line that up along the left side and spray some paint right. I'm also trying to lightly glaze an even layer of this paint across the whole surface of that upper lip. And this is important for the techniques that I'm going to be using because I will be erasing into that area for these textures. One thing I want to add here is that you may have noticed that in the completed painting that the shadows along the right side of the mouth are essentially going to be pure black. For the first layer, just like always, I apply the paint much lighter than it needs to be. This is going to give me a lot more flexibility to adjust the edges and fix any mistakes if and when they come up. Only when I'm really confident that everything is in the right place, then I'll darken up the values, and it's really easy to do. I just spray more paint into those areas. The more paint, the darker it's going to get. I'm using a soft eraser to remove some paint above the upper lip where this highlight's going to be. Now it's going to get too bright here, but that's not a problem because I'm going to be glazing more layers of paint over this later on. And then within that upper lip, I'm going to start drawing in the placement of the highlights that I've seen here, that I'm seeing in my reference, and also use that eraser to again clean up some of the overspray along the left side, within that background. And so after that erasing and comparing my painting against the grids in my reference photo, I'm pretty confident that this shadow is in the right place. So what I'm doing here is spraying in some more paint to darken it and set it in place. I'll use that shield to mask off the background, spray some paint along the left side of the lip, and then I'm going to come in with the airbrush freehand and paint in a few of the shadows that I'm seeing within this upper lip. And then to sharpen up a few of those edges, I'm using my soft eraser, working around that shadow that I painted in, and also pulling out some highlights in this upper lip where they're needed. And I'm never just randomly adding highlights or shadows. I'm paying attention to my reference photo that's guiding me. That's going to tell me where I need to add these highlights. I'm going to use this Staedtler ink eraser, which is much more aggressive. I have the edge cut to a chisel, and I'm using this to pull out some highlights within the mustache. I saw these in my reference photo, some brighter areas within these shadows, so I'm using my eraser to draw in a few dashes, lines, and a few dots. I'm also removing some of this paint along the transition between the hair and the skin right at the top of the mustache. Now this is going to break up that edge and give some separation between the lines of paint. I'll also do this along the bottom. You'll see that it starts to break it up, gives a more natural hair look, especially along those transitions. There's a very bright highlight here to the right of the mouth, so I'm using a soft eraser with a fair amount of pressure to remove all the paint in this area. And as I move along to the left side where we have some of this subtle skin texture, I'm erasing in small circular motions with a very light amount of pressure. And now this technique does not remove that much paint, but it adds some variety within the values here. So we have some darker areas and some lighter areas within this part of the skin, and it starts to give the impression of skin texture. I'll continue this technique into some parts of the nose, which I just noticed are getting a bit too dark, and if I want some areas lighter using this eraser, I make more passes over it and I apply a little bit more pressure. What I'm essentially doing here is just trying to break up that overly soft look that you get from atomized paint from an airbrush. A lot of times it's just too soft, too smooth, so a bit of erasing helps break it up. There are of course other ways to do this, which I'll show later on in the video, but the eraser is my favorite technique, so that's what I use most often. Now I went back over some parts of the facial hair with that black paint to help darken up some of those highlights that I erased before. They were a bit too bright, so a quick layer of paint darkens them back up. For this lower lip, the first thing that I did was paint in that darker shadow along the bottom. It's a softer edge, so I painted it in freehand. And there's also the shadow that moves up the lip vertically, and it has a sharp edge on the right side, so I used a shield, lined it up, sprayed some paint over to the left. I'm using that semicircle shield to mask off the background and spray some paint across this lower lip. This again is going to give me something to erase into. I'll go back to my eraser to clean up the background, remove some of that overspray, and now I'll work into this lower lip, removing the highlights in between these shadows. So another shadow I added on the right side, and I just continue working with this eraser to build up these textures, get some light and get some dark in here. And again, just a reminder, I'm always starting very light with my values. Once I'm confident they're in the right place, then I'll start going darker and darker by adding more paint. So I'll add a few more layers of paint into that shadow, and then I'll use my eraser to continue drawing in these highlights on the lower lip. Before I work into this area a little bit more, I want to map in the placement of the shadow and the facial hair below the mouth. So I'm spraying some value in to cover up some parts of the panel just below it. This is also going to map in the placement of the highlight between this shadow and the lower lip. And then I sprayed some more paint into that shadow along the lower part of this lip, and then I'll use my eraser again to make a few more passes within here to pull out those highlights. So again, just kind of repeating that process of adding and removing paint. That's looking pretty good for now, so I'm going to add some more paint below this into the skin texture and to the left where the facial hair is going to be. I'm just going to spray some more in there to make it darker. And while I'm working on this painting or any painting, I'm always going back to areas that I worked on before, because sometimes as I'm painting something new, I'll spot something that I missed in the earlier stages. So I'll just go back with my eraser or my airbrush and adjust them. So at this point, we have all the major features painted in, so I can start doing some skin texture here. We're going to start on the cheek here, and the first thing I want to point out is that you can see that I already have a very thin glaze of paint within this part of the painting. That's what we sprayed in last week's video. So very light, even glaze of black paint. It's just covering up some of that white panel. And what I'm doing here is using some over-reduced black paint. It's about 2 to 3 parts of distilled water to 1 part paint. And I'm very lightly spraying in some dots. Some of these are going to be sharper by holding the airbrush a little bit closer to that surface and spraying some more paint. And some of them are going to be a bit softer by backing off a little bit and spraying less paint. I'm always spraying air. I'm just rocking the trigger backward and forward to apply paint where I want it. The only time I lift my trigger finger up to stop the air is when I'm just thinking about where I'm going to add the next few dots. And I'm doing the best I can to add some variety in here. You'll see that some are larger, some are smaller, and this is just another way to help break up that overly soft look that you get from an airbrush, especially when you're spraying it at a distance. Now I'll speed up the video because this is kind of a slow process, but you'll see that as I move to the right, I'm holding the airbrush a little bit farther back from the surface to spray in some softer values of this black paint. And once I get some of these painted in, I'm going to switch over to my eraser. And just like I showed before, I'm erasing in small circular motions, maybe a few small dashes in here, and I'm working into some areas of highlight. I can blend these highlights into the midtones and shadows with the amount of pressure that I use on the eraser and the amount of passes that I make with it. And just like painting with the airbrush for those darker values, I'm trying to add some variety into these eraser marks. I'll continue using those techniques, using a shield to spray in some of the darker shadows and each sharper lines, and I want to apply a light glaze of this paint along the right side of the cheek within that shadow. Then I'll follow that up with a few passes with the eraser, add the first layer of texture in there, and then I'll glaze a little bit more paint over the top to darken it, as well as spraying some below it so we have something to work into later as we build up the skin textures. I'm going to go back to my soft eraser here and work in this highlight along the left side of the cheek. I'm using the edge of my eraser here instead of the tip to overlap these strokes and pull out a pretty even value of paint within this area. And if I notice that it's looking a little blotchy, it means that there's some darker areas within there that I didn't erase out. So I'll just make sure I'll make another pass over the top and lighten those darker areas up. This way it evens everything out. And that's what I'm doing with my eraser here in a few of the areas that I painted earlier, just working around, lightening up some of the dark spots. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to do this throughout the painting, come back to some areas that I worked on earlier, and just smooth out some of the skin texture. And now another great way to break up that overly soft airbrush look is to use a texture stencil like I'm doing here. I've shown this one a lot on the channel. It's just one that I made myself. It's a piece of Mylar. I burned a bunch of random holes in it, all different sizes. And when I spray over it in different parts of the stencil, that dot texture gets transferred over to my panel. You'll see that as I'm spraying in these random dot textures, I'm trying to add them into the shadow on the cheek. So I spray a small amount of that texture stencil, lift it up, move it to another part of the painting, spray a bit more. And I control the values of these textures by how much paint I'm spraying through that stencil. So one thing I want to show you here is how forgiving this painting and erasing technique can be. I'll rewind the video here so you can see this mistake again. Let's say I spray the texture in an area that I don't want, like within this highlight. All I need to do is use my soft eraser and make a few passes in this area. Maybe I'll focus a little bit more attention on some of the darker dots, and that's going to help lighten them and subdue them. Now there is going to be some texture within this highlight, so I'm not going to erase these all the way back down to the blank panel. But if I wanted to, I can easily do that by using more pressure on that eraser, making a few passes, or switching over to a more aggressive one if I need to. Mistakes can always be fixed in a painting, and I just showed you one way to fix it here. There's many other options as well. It's just really, really important not to panic and give up when a mistake happens. You can always fix it with a bit of work. Now I'm combining all of those techniques that I just covered to start rendering out the rest of the skin texture. There's no secrets or real tricks to this. Honestly, it's about working the best that you can and trying to solve those inevitable little problems as they come up. For the first layer of the beard, I'm going to follow the same process that I used for the mustache. Starting first with an even layer of paint, a little bit darker than the skin texture, which is going to act as a base layer, so I can start adding some texture on top of this. And then I'll use my airbrush freehand, spraying in those same little dots and squiggles along the outer contour so that the transition between the background and the beard isn't too smooth and uniform. And then once I get those in, I'll fill in the darker area within the beard by spraying some larger dots and keeping some distance from my airbrush to the surface and pulling a little bit farther back on the airbrush trigger. This way you'll see that I'm filling in the dark value within the beard, but I'm adding some variety within the values here. Some darker spots and some lighter spots. For a few of the thinner highlights in here, instead of using an eraser, I'm using an X-Acto blade, scratching out some lines. And because that pulls out all the paint, so you get a really bright highlight, I can darken them with another glaze of paint over the top. And those highlights are still there. It's another layer of texture, but it's much more subtle and much more subdued. I'll clean up some of this overspray within the background, and then I'll use this different eraser to draw in some texture within the beard. The eraser gives a softer and lighter highlight because it doesn't pull out too much paint, and the X-Acto blade gives you a really bright, sharp highlight, so you can just kind of mix them up in here. I'm working with my eraser to pull out some highlights within this surrounding skin texture. And another interesting technique that I'm doing here is just drawing in a bunch of little dashes and dots by tapping the eraser against the surface. You'll see that it pulls out these small but still pretty sharp highlights, and then to knock the value back down, another glaze of paint right over it. And I'll extend this dark value down and along to the right to set that shadow in place. From here, I'm going to add a few more dots in with my airbrush and then come back in with the eraser to pull out some of the highlights that got a little bit too dark from the overspray. Now I'm going to expand the shadow along the neck, so I'm using a freehand shield to line up along the right side and spraying some paint up, just a little bit. And then I'll add some paint to block in the placement of where the beard is going to be and continue spraying in some of that texture, those little lines and squiggles along the edge between the transition of the hair and the skin texture. There's a few stray hairs and some patches of hair within the skin texture that's not directly connected with the beard. So you'll see I'm painting in a few of those right now. I do that with the airbrush just to give some of the softer edges, and later on I'll use a black colored pencil to draw in a few of the very thin hairs. And so that's going to be it for this one. That's all the techniques that I use for rendering skin texture and facial hair in a portrait like this. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done on this one, but all I did to finish it was continue using those same techniques over and over until I got to this final painting. And for this type of painting and erasing technique, like I said a bunch of times, remember just to go light with your paint first and slowly build up to those darkest values. It's going to make everything so much easier. So thank you all for being here. Thank you so much for watching, and a huge thank you to the very generous support of the current channel members scrolling up on the screen now. Be well, everyone. I'll see you back here next time.